Would you ask Mr. Brown to come back in, please? Thank you. Right, Mr. Brown, ready to carry on?
Yes, thank you, sir.
Good, thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Kinnear.
Thanks, sir. Good afternoon again, Mr. Brown.
Good afternoon.
We were looking before the break at the LACNOG control report. Could we go back to that in paragraph 295 again, which we find HOM quadruple 01124/50. Now, obviously, the report was published a few months before the exchange with Rita Dexter that we were looking at before lunch. Can we look under the heading assessment and reassessment of the caller again, and in particular the fourth line, the sentence which starts with the word moving to. And what it says there is moving to protect advice with the intent of keeping the caller safe may not always be the best solution, and the call should be continually reassessed. There may be a tendency to limit reassessment due to the protect ethos. Now, we know that the reassess guidance in PM 539 was not revised before the Grenfell Tower fire. Are you able to help us as to why PM 539 and the reassess guidance was not reviewed and revised before the Grenfell fire?
I can only offer an opinion.
If you can't speak to a fact, then...
Well, tell us what you want to tell us, and then we'll see where it takes us.
Well, my opinion is that the belief was that the reassessed terminology in there that we looked at earlier was considered sufficient, and brigade staff, be they control or operational staff, would always have in their mind about the need to reassess, be it continually or otherwise. So it was implicit in it, would be my opinion.
Yeah, thank you.
Now, if we can stay with this page and just look at the top, really I've got in mind paragraphs 293 and 294. 293, the paragraph entitled Expectations that Callers Would Be Rescued and Stay Put Advice. Below that in 294, alternative escape routes. Did you ask anyone from Control to review PN 539 and the RIFs against these other conclusions which are set out in the Control report?
Not specifically. My understanding was these would be part of the general review.
And caught up in the generality?
Yes.
Thank you. Now, can we turn to a separate issue, which is non-compliance with national guidance in the sense of failure to warn against providing false reassurance, or
yes,
apparent non-compliance, if I can put it more neutrally. Can we return to your comments of January 2013 on the Lindridge review, which we find at LFB 000-858-54/13? Thank you. And on page 13, we see action 10 dealt with. And below that, against the review process findings box, it says this: PN 539 has been reviewed as a result of this action and does not contradict FSC 1093. Looking at the corresponding comment box on the far right-hand side, the Deputy Commissioner asked this, but does it comply? And you respond in bold and in red this: yes, it does, and on that basis this action has been discharged. On what basis did you assure the Deputy Commissioner that PN 539 was in fact compliant?
Can I just read the remainder of the comment, please?
Of course.
The basis on which I constructed that comment was on assurances I had on two fronts. One, from the Lacken House Board that Scott attended in the discussions with Scott Hayward, but then also following my instruction to Richard in terms of satisfying himself, and the positive reaction I got from both of those was the basis on which I made that statement.
If we can stay in this particular paragraph of the review process findings, and if we could go 4 lines down, it says this: whilst it could be argued that PN 539 does not contain all of the information in the national guidance, it should be noted that the format of the national guidance, the detail is in the form of a training package, does not lend itself to a methodical approach. Can you help us as to why national guidance did not lend itself to the methodical approach?
My understanding was that national guidance, particularly 1093, was a best part of 20 years prior to when we were making these comments, and the methodical approach that we'd moved to in our approach for fire survival guidance calls in the London Fire Brigade had somewhat moved on from what this guidance was saying.
Now, in the corresponding comment box that Rita Dexter asked, and we can't find a way to rise above that, and you replied, possibly textually, yes, and we are. What way, which you didn't necessarily reveal to Rita Dexter here, had you found to rise above the methodical deficiencies of the national guidance?
That was purely on 2 fronts. Firstly, the training we were giving to staff, the fact that we were moving towards command unit training as a result of Policy Note 790, which was one of the other recommendations in here, and also the reference information files that staff were instructed to follow routinely with all fire survival guidance calls after Lacanau, and those files that had been revised.
Now, you see in the bottom of this box the question, what is the conclusion here? Have we discharged the action in word and spirit or not? Now, on my reading, that appears to be another comment from Rita Dexter. Is that right? And that your reply follows this time in emboldened orange.
I don't know whether that is Rita and myself. Looking at the attached actions, it would seem logical that is, but I don't know for sure whether that is Rita's comment and my response.
Let's assume it is. You replied, my view is that yes, it is discharged in word and spirit, question mark. Now, assuming that question mark is a mistake, so far as you were concerned, was it your view that PN 539 complied with the letter of 1093 and achieved its purpose, that's to say, to enable CROs to assess a situation and to give appropriate advice?
On that basis, yes.
Now, can we explore that a little further? And could we start with page 16 of the version of PN 539 that was then in force, which we can find at LFB 00113394/16. Appendix 3 again. And if we could look at the middle of this page and the 3rd bullet point, which says this: provide reassurance to the caller that help and assistance is forthcoming. And then if we can go again to the 4th line from the bottom, which we looked at before lunch, which says reassure the caller. Now, if we can now go to FSC 1093, which you can find at LFB 000361-7, looking at page 1 and paragraph 2, the last sentence of the latter says this: additionally, in circumstances such as these, a fire control operator may need to take into account that the normal procedure of calming the caller may not be appropriate and may even be dangerous in some circumstances. And if we can also turn to LFB 00118948. Now, this is the training note, which is properly called Keeping People Safe. I think sometimes it's called Making People Safe in correspondence, but if we can turn to page 6, we see in the right-hand column, the second paragraph says this, and if that could be amplified: attempt should be made to reassure the caller without promoting a false sense of security. Now, bearing in mind that Keeping People Safe was intended to supplement 1093, would you accept that PN 539 did not warn against the dangers of reassuring the caller? Would you like to go back and see PN 539?
Yes, please.
If we go back to that, which is at LFB 00113394/16. And what I was looking at before, that third bullet point on the page, and going further down, 4 lines from the bottom, reassurance. So just looking at those, bearing in mind 1093 and Keeping People Safe, would you accept that PN 539 did not warn against the dangers of reassuring the caller?
If I can give a caveated answer to that, I would accept that it isn't explicit in terms of making it clear of the dangers of reassurance, as in 1093. However, the caveat I would add to that is that the reference information file and the training that control staff got, I think, made it clear that there's a selection of phrases that one can use in terms of talking to the caller, some of which would be reassurance, and if used in the wrong situation, could be dangerous. But the training that control staff get is, only use those phrases as and when applicable, and particularly after Lacanau.
Looking back at the unqualified assurance that you appear to have given Rita Dexter, would you accept that essentially that PM 539 complied with both the letter and spirit of the government guidance, in particular 1093, that unqualified assurance was misplaced?
I suppose in looking at this in reflection, the phrase word and spirit was probably stretching it. Probably in word was an incorrect choice of words, but in spirit I would still maintain that in spirit, yes, it did meet it.
Can I now turn to a separate and distinct topic, which is PM 539 and the relevant equality impact assessment? Now, if we look at the version of PN 539 which was reviewed as current on the 28th of March 2014, and which was the version in force on the 14th of June 2017, that can be found at LFB 000737. And if we could turn to page 22. You see, just coming down from the top, there's a heading Audit Trail. And we can see the content of that box shows that the policy was amended on a number of occasions between June 2010 and April 2017. Is that a fair reading of what's set out there?
Yes.
Now, if we can look at the heading Assessments, which I think is at the top of the page and has been lopped off. Thank you. And the table immediately below that, we see the initials EIA. They stand for Equality Impact Assessment. Is that right?
That's correct.
And the date next to that is the 17th of September 2008. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
Now, you are the policy owner of PN 539. Do you accept that in your capacity as policy owner, it was your responsibility to ensure that an EIA was carried out to confirm that amendments to the policy did not discriminate against anyone and indeed promoted equality?
Where necessary, absolutely, yes, it was my responsibility.
Are you able to help us, therefore, as to why no equality impact assessment was carried out, completed, after the 17th of September 2008?
Yes, if I can just briefly explain, when when all the various notes in the fire brigade were transferred to policy notes in a way to try to rationalise all the different instruction policies we had in London Fire Brigade, which would have been around the 2008 Equalities Impact Assessment was carried out on all of them at that point. And thereafter, an Equalities Impact Assessment wasn't routinely carried out at every time the policy was renewed or refreshed. It was as and when something was included that was felt that an EIA would be necessary. And I don't believe that we determined an EIA to be necessary at the 3-yearly review in 2010 or 2013. Certainly looking back now, some 9 years later, yes, probably an EIA should have been carried out at some point.
Can you help us, though, as to why it wasn't, given the whole document was reviewed on the 3rd of September 2010?
Because nothing was included at that time that felt an EIA was necessary.
Can I move on to a separate issue now, which is pre-inquest action 14, and that concerned the review of policy 790. And I think as we go through this, 790 in its previous guise was PN 155.
Its working title, yes.
Now, the development of PN 790 described the two-way exchange of critical information between control and the incident ground when FSG calls were incoming.
That's correct.
And the first thing I'd like to discuss with you, as with all these actions, is to establish the extent of your involvement and role with particular actions. Now, Joe Smith said this in a witness statement, and we can go to it. It's LFB 00121219/26. And looking at paragraph 69, she said this: I had some involvement in the development of PN 790 with Patrick Utting after the Lacknell House fire. I reviewed PN 790 from a control perspective to ensure that the words and descriptions were accurate. I also recommended that a change of advice given to residents in high-rise buildings could occur and needed to be included in the policy. This work was carried out in 2011 before I was seconded to CFOA. PN 790 was not, at that time, a shared policy between operational firefighters and control. Now, as the allocated lead officer for this particular action, did you ask Joe Smith to carry out this work?
No, I always would have gone through Scott Hayward. I wouldn't have had any objection with Joe doing it, but I wouldn't have bypassed Scott and gone straight to Joe. I didn't bypass Scott and go straight to Joe.
What was the nature and extent of your involvement in the development of PN 790?
I had no direct involvement in the drafting, although the command units that were a key part of this triangulation between control, the fireground and the caller were a key part of that, and I was managing those. So I had a particular interest in this, obviously, because all of my various responsibilities fitted under it at one point or other.
Just following on from that point, Joe Smith says in the final sentence of this paragraph that PN 790 was not, at least at that time, a shared policy between ops and control. Now, if we look at the version of the policy issued on the 23rd of February 2012 and reviewed as current on the 17th of April 2014, and we can find that, we don't need to go to it, but it was owned by, and I quote, the head of Incident Command Policy and the Operations Review Team. On that description of ownership, it would appear to be shared ownership that applied to that policy. Is that a fair and accurate reading?
No, I don't think it is, because I think what Joe is referring to is obviously shared between firefighters and control, and the owners that you've described are operational departments. I think that's what she's referring to. as a point of order, I don't agree with what she's saying, but I think that's what she's referring to.
Understood. So just to clear matters up, did you understand the policy to be shared or not?
The authorship wasn't, although Control were heavily involved in a consultation, but the delivery of the policy and what the policy talked about was absolutely shared.
I have to say, I find it slightly odd to have this concept of a policy being owned by one bit of the organisation and not by another bit, particularly where they're both affected by its content. Does that strike you as being odd as well?
Not really, sir. Maybe it's because I was so close to it that it didn't appear odd, but the ownership really is about who manages the updating of the policy. So in terms of making sure it's kept current and reviewed every 3 years. That doesn't mean to say it's only that group of staff that the policy applies to. At the end of the day, someone has to own it, and then it's deciding who's best suited to own it. And I think that some people, some members of staff, look too much into who owns it, and on that basis make a decision in their own mind that therefore doesn't apply to me, and that's completely correct.
Yeah. Right, thank you.
Now, can we go to a separate document, which is LFB 000333266? Now, this is an email chain, and if we can go to page 2, and we see the initiating email sent by Pat Utting on the 11th of February 2011, under which he sent you and others a draft of PN 790, as you say, then described as PN 155 when it was in development. And that it was sent to you as part of the informal management consultation process. Was this the first time you'd seen a properly worked up draft of PN 790?
I believe so, yes.
Did you review it? And by review, I mean scrutinise.
No, my normal practice, and I can't imagine it'd be any different with this, will be to pass it to my Deputy Assistant Commissioners and also Control for their view of it, and then to feed back to me.
Essentially to those who are better placed and closer to the detail to provide the detailed review that it required.
Yes, and they may in turn consult some of their borough commanders for their very up close advice.
And following on from that answer, if we can scroll up, we see that you forwarded the policy to Scott Hayward and Joe Smith, who was then Stibbards, as well as Som Turner, and you said, as we can see here, you are presumably already happy with this as you have inputted into it. Was that your understanding that they had in fact contributed to this draft before it was circulated?
Yeah, absolutely. I knew via Scott that there was close consultation going on in the development of this policy.
Had they fed up to you the substance of the drafting queries and extent of the development of the policy that they were evaluating?
No, but they had shared with me some of the exercises that were being put into place to test the accuracy and effectiveness of the policy.
Were you aware, though, of the overall direction of travel in which the draft was going?
Absolutely. In terms of the triangulation of information and the issues that had come out at Lacanau, I was absolutely well aware of that.
If we can scroll up again, please. We see an email from Joe Smith. And she said this: Dave, I've worked closely on producing this document with Patrick, that's Utting, to ensure it aligns with our documentation, and we'll get to see and discuss any suggested revisions from the consultation before published. So I'm very happy with the policy so far. Is it fair to say, on the basis of your evidence thus far, that given that assurance, you are happy to effectively sign off on what had been produced by that stage?
Yeah, subject to what other information I received from my Deputy Assistant Commissioners, yes.
And you had no separate views of your own to communicate to Pat Utting at this stage?
No.
Can we go to another email chain? LFB 000 quadruple 3 2. You see, as per for every email chain in this inquiry, the starting one is always at the bottom of the page. And we see an email dated the 13th of April 2011 from Michelle, is it Kaneka?
Kaneki, I think.
Sent to Assistant Commissioners, including you, a further draft of PN 790, still then described as 155, and she asked the following. Please provide any comments or feedback you care to offer on this draft to myself on or before Wednesday the 4th of May. Please also assess the impact of this new procedure on your department and advise what, if any, activities, further work will need to be undertaken before this procedure is implemented. For example, does this new procedure require change, such as current training provision, service delivery resources, or future strategic planning? Now, if we go to the top of the page, you forward this to Assistant Commissioner Cotton, as she then was, on the 14th of April, copying in various others. You asked Assistant Commissioner Cotton, who then was Head of Operational Assurance, to please arrange for comments for me from your team, and asked other recipients, as per our recent agreement, comments to me, if you wish, please. Why were you asking Assistant Commissioner Cotton and her team for comments?
Because Danny Cotton had responsibility for the operational review team, and as I imagine the inquiry has heard, the operational review team would attend incidents in an audit and monitoring capacity. So they were a really useful group of staff in terms of seeing things that were happening on the fire ground and could give an independent view. So I wanted their view as to the potential success or not of this policy.
What was the recent agreement you were referring to there?
I think that was as a result of discussion, because the CCs were at that time my Deputy Assistant Commissioners for the 4 areas, and we discussed it at a Principal Management Board meeting, and I'd mentioned to them that I'd want further comments from them.
Did you scrutinise this most recent iteration of the policy in draft?
I don't believe so, no.
Did you carry out, or ask someone else to carry out, the task of assessing the impact of the new procedure on control and advise what, if any, activities further work would be needed, as Ms. Kanuki asked?
I discussed with Scott how it would work in practice, not from the point of view of should we or shouldn't we adopt this policy, because it was a recommendation we'd highlighted for ourselves that was necessary. And not from the point of view of do we need more staff, but it was from the point of view that how would this work in practice.
Do you remember further training requirements being discussed with you by Mr. Hayward, or indeed anyone else, in relation to control following from the implementation of this draft policy?
Not further training requirements. The issue for control was, of course, twofold. One is the fire survival guidance, which there was training already in train for, and then secondly there was the issues of passing the information that will be gathered from fire survival guidance through the command unit to the fire ground. So it was those two issues that we discussed.
Thank you. I'm now going to move on to a separate and distinct topic, which is consideration of stay put, an instance where there are a large number of FSG calls being received. Now, if we can first of all go to what was the February 2011 draft of Policy 155, as it then was, and we can find that at LFB 000 83559. There it is. We can see from the top it's draft 155 and its date February 2011. Could we go to page 4 within this document? And paragraph 7.10, please. that provision reads, in exceptional circumstances, an IC, Incident Commander, may consider informing control that their advice to FSG callers should be altered, e.g., to attempt to leave their property. Were you specifically aware of that provision?
Yes.
And had that specific provision been brought to your attention by anyone, or is it something you alighted upon as part of your reading of the document?
It was the latter.
Did you consider whether control staff would need guidance on that particular provision, whether via policy such as PN 539 or RIFs or by training?
My expectation would be that this would find its way into all three of those documentation, and or a link to 790 in it where this mentions. But yes, it should certainly, in terms of training and RIFs, be reflected.
Can I press you on that? Was it in reality your assumption that that would be done, or did you actively consider what changes were necessary either to policy or to the RIFs or to training?
No, I didn't actively consider what they may be. It was my assumption that those working on this would have made that link across to the relevant documents.
Does it follow from that answer that you didn't consider whether these changes, or rather control room staff, required guidance on what information they should be gathering so as to assist the incident commander to determine whether a partial or total evacuation was necessary?
Well, this policy at the back has a control information form that details that very information. So my expectation is that that information already exists in terms of being laid out what control staff should do, and then in the training that would go ahead jointly between command units, control, etc., that did go ahead, that would be included in that. So that would be covered off there.
So you didn't think that any further information beyond that identified was necessary?
Not in addition to what I've already laid out, no.
Did you consider what advice would have to be given to the caller if the incident commander did change stay put advice and a decision was made to evacuate?
I didn't consider exactly what difference that advice would be at that moment in time. However, in subsequent discussions and looking at various exercises and the outcome of exercises, it was a thought process that I had thereafter.
The results of those exercises had triggered you to think what further information and what further advice needs to be given?
Yeah, not in so much that I thought actually there's something missing, but then obviously started to focus in my mind on what that would be.
Can we look at paragraph 7.11 in this draft, which says this: the incident commander should consider the early ordering of an additional CU to assist in managing the FSG calls, especially if control is dealing with multiple FSG calls. Other personnel may be required to manage information if a large number of FSG calls have been received. Control has experience of handling up to 5 FSG calls relating to a single incident. Again, were you specifically aware of that provision?
That I was aware of it because I read it. It wasn't brought to my attention.
Can you help us with what precisely was meant by the phrase "a large number of FSG calls"? Was there a threshold in mind?
No, there wasn't. I think there's obviously single, multiple, and large and multiple. Just dictionary definition is more than one. So therefore, in my mind, multiple is 2+, and large, one imagines that we're talking about 5, but that's only because 5's mentioned and 5 was at Lacanau. I think it's not particularly helpful that we use generic phrases like that, but then in saying that, I don't see what it would add if we were specific in terms of 2, 1, 5, etc. I'm not quite sure what else that brings to the policy.
I suppose the only advantage would be it gives a specific threshold to concentrate the minds of not only the incident commander but control room officers as to whether withdrawal of stay put needs to be considered, and if so, the nature and extent of evacuation.
It does, but I would say to that it's always potentially dangerous to give parameters such as that, because every incident is different. And every fire is different, and buildings are different, and when you put them together, the circumstances are different. So to put an unnecessary threshold on something that 5 FSGs means something, it might mean something in a certain circumstances, but it might be well within capabilities on a different one. So we rely very much on professional judgment, which is why I guess the phrases there are quite generic.
Did you consider whether PN 790 should include some form of strategy or guidance for control room staff so that they would know how best to respond to multiple FSGs, for example, 5?
No, because in my view, this is a scale issue of normal business. So not normal business in terms of we get lots of fire survival guidance calls. That's clearly not the case. But control can become very busy in a very short space of time, and are used to handling lots of different incidents at one time. So it's not unusual for a 20 pump fire and a 12 pump fire to be going at the same time, or lots of 4 or 6 pump fires, which are very resource intensive, and control are used to managing that. So in terms of fire survival guidance calls, it's a different proposition, but it's the same knowledge, skills and experience that they use on a daily basis in terms of being able to multitask.
Now, I think when you gave evidence in October, you referred to a fire at a Marriott Hotel in Poplar.
Yes.
And I think the date of that was the 11th of November 2010. Now, can we go to LFB 000333196/3? Here we see, roughly a third of the way down this page, that Andy Hickmott emailed you on the 12th of November 2010 at 13:13 hours, as well as Scott Hayward and others, about the fire in Poplar. And he said this: Scott, Dave, with regard to last night's 10 pump fire, as I'm sure you've been made aware, this was a particularly challenging incident for control, given the number and nature of fire survival calls they handled, some of which went on for over an hour. Despite the pressures, the way information was passed to the fireground, enabling searching and in some cases rescues to be undertaken, seemed excellent. Can you explain why it was a particularly challenging incident?
I wasn't at the incident, but I did speak with Andy after. I think it was challenging because the nature of the fire itself was not so extensive as one might imagine from the way this incident has turned out, i.e. 10 pumps and a number of fire survival guidance calls. So I think there was issues in terms of locating the fire, and the smoke travel through the corridors had been quite extensive. And because it was a hotel, there's always the issue about knowing exactly who is where, and having someone knowing the residents there, because they're a transient group of people.
Now, we know, although there's some debate about it, there were at least 8 FSG calls on the night, and certainly an amount that exceeded the 5 that happened at Lacknall. Did the number of FSG calls following the Poplar fire, at the Poplar fire, prompt any discussion about Control's capacity to handle that volume of FSG calls?
No.
Why not?
because I think that they handled them superbly well. And so whilst Andy says it was challenging, certainly it was a busy night for control, and they did very well, as I would expect them to do. But I'm not quite sure they saw it as challenging as maybe Andy saw it, who wasn't there and wasn't experienced in the way control operates. So I think they saw it as a busy day at the office.
Did it prompt any consideration of the need to plan, at least, or to train in relation to an incident that involved, say, for example, 8 fire survival guidance calls?
I think at this time we were already developing the 34 actions from Lacanau House, and we obviously had the issue of Policy Note 790 in mind. So in our view, we were working towards this and the transfer of information, and we'd already started the programme of training on fire survival guidance calls as a result of Lacanau. So I think in our mind this just reinforced the work we were already doing.
Is that after the event rationalisation of the thought process, or was it something you consciously considered at the time?
It's an after the event, I guess,
Okay.
because it never come to me at the time that we needed to do it, and I'm trying to think of why that might have been.
Can we go to LFB 000 33397? Apologies, it's another email chain. And if we can go to look at the bottom of the first page, there's an email sent on the 13th of July 2011, timed at 0908 hours. Pat Utting emailed your staff officer, David Chandler, who I think also goes under the name of Barney, is that right?
That's correct, yes.
With a further draft of PN 790, still described as 155. And he says this: could you run this past Mr. Brown, please? There have been a few changes since he last saw it following the testing of this policy at an 8-pump exercise. The main change is a 2-tier mobilisation. Essentially, one fire survival guidance call will attract a person's reported attendance. 2 or more, or an FSG call at a high-rise building, will attract the PR attendance and a dedicated PL, CU and SM. So just for the avoidance of doubt, for people who are unfamiliar, PR stands for what?
Persons reported.
PL?
Pump ladder, command unit and station manager.
Thank you. Now, David Chandler responded, and if we can de-amplify at the top of the page. Leave it with me and I'll get back to you ASAP. Did Mr. Chandler run the policy past you? Can you remember?
I believe he did, yes.
Did you or were you content with the draft in the state that was put before you at this time?
I was content with the addition of recognising extra fire survival guidance calls and putting that extra mobilisation on, yes.
And did you consider whether the 2-tier mobilisation based on one FSG call and 2 or more FSG call system was an adequate way of responding to a large number of FSG calls?
I considered it appropriate for that point in terms of 1 for persons reported, a second attendance for more. It wouldn't be appropriate if there were extensive fire survival guidance calls, but then, as I said earlier, we rely on the professional judgment of officers to order on more resources as they see fit, dependent on the circumstances at the time. So I thought that was a good predetermined attendance approach to get things moving, to take the heat off the incident commander in terms of thinking about resources at that early stage.
Can we now turn on to the Lindridge review itself? We've glanced at it occasionally, dated the January 2013. If we can go to LFB 000 33943/6. Now, Group Manager Lindridge considered Action 14, and we can see it roughly midway down that page, and he said this: control staff perceive PN 790 as an operational policy for frontline personnel. Specific observations made as a result of this view have been fed back to the AC OPR, that's you, and will be considered in a forthcoming review of control FSG policy. Can you remember now what those specific observations were?
Yes, I think they really were just around Dave Lindridge talking to control staff. And it's as we were discussing not that long ago this morning, the fact that control staff appeared to view this as an operational policy. So I don't think it was anything more specific than his opening sentence, really.
And can you help us as to what the forthcoming review of FSG policy was referring to here?
That would have...
It's not clear what it would be.
No, that I think he's referring to policy note 539 and the fact that it was up for its 3-yearly review.
Could we now go to LFB 00033 943/13? And if we can see at the bottom of page 13, in the review process findings box for action 14, Mr. Lindridge said this: PN 790 was authored by representatives from Instant over the page. Was authored by representatives from Instant Management Policy and Control. The procedures describes two-way exchange of FSG information. This was tested in an exercise at Stratford, 16th of June 2011, with feedback shared with the authors. Overall, it was a success, but did identify that FSG is resource-intensive at control. Do you know who'd concluded that FSG was resource-intensive at control?
Not who the specific person was. I imagine it was observations from Pat Utting, who was there at these exercises.
Now, can we, in this context, go back to the LACNOR control report, which is at HOM quadruple 01124/49. Thank you. And if we could look at paragraph 287, we see here it's headed workload. And if we could go to the third line of this paragraph, which says this: control resources were dedicated to dealing with 3 FSG calls at the same time during the period 1635 to 1650. This will have made overall call handling more complex, given the need for a supervisor or another control officer to be available to support the control officer dealing with the FSG call, and increase both workloads and the personal pressure on the staff involved. In his statement, C.C. Simmons said, "During my many years' service, I've experienced other major incidents involving similar levels of focus, commitment, and volume of work. However, the unfolding and deteriorating circumstances experienced by the trapped persons who are communicating with the control room created an intensity that I've never previously experienced and placed my staff and I in a unique situation." Now, given that particular assessment, did you take any action to ensure that the level of resource in control could meet the challenges posed by FSG calls, particularly incidents where there were multiple FSG calls?
I'm well aware of this paragraph, and I never took any specific action in terms of do I need more staffing, etc. We'd carried out a shift review that was, I think, in place at this time, where we'd reallocated resources to match the busier times of the day statistically when fire calls are received. But I was also comfortable on 2 other issues, really. One is the what we call the buddy or fallback arrangements, if you like, using other control centres. And we had specific arrangements in place with Staffordshire and North West Fire Control that fell out of the National Fire Control Project, as well as mutual aid arrangements with surrounding brigades, plus also the fact that we could have arrangements within the control room in terms of thinking about how the support from supervisors and control officers manifested itself. So in Lakanal, there was one call that went on for a long period of time and was very traumatic and demanding, but then another two calls were very quick. So it could well be that resources could be rationalised if there were some simultaneous calls within the control room before we went to the buddy arrangements with other control centres that gave us, to a degree, unlimited support.
Well, thank you. Can we now turn, whilst looking at Action 14, Exercise Florin, which was an exercise that was held on the 20th of December 2012, so a few weeks or so after the Lakanal Control Report was published. Could we go to LFB 001222827? Now, this is what's described as a facilitator briefing for the exercise. Can we go to page 3? Where the exercise objectives are set out, and we can see that it was an exercise to test the effectiveness of PN 790. Presumably you were aware of exercise Florin, is that right?
Yes.
Did you attend the briefing following the exercise?
I attended one exercise. I can't remember which one it was, though, I'm afraid.
Now, looking at these objectives, do you agree that the emphasis of the exercise was on the transfer and recording of FSG information and not the handling of FSG calls?
I can see why you'd say that. I think the first bullet point, information gathered by control officers from fire survival callers, deeply implies fire survival guidance calls, but it's not explicit.
No, it's not clear whether it deeply implies it. Call handling doesn't appear to be a phrase, or indeed there's no synonym for it in its objectives. Would you accept that?
Well, I accept that, but you can't gather information from fire survival callers without call handling. So,
the aim of the exercise does not seem to have involved handling a build-up of FSG calls. Would you agree with that?
No, it doesn't deal with a build-up, no.
And it doesn't appear to consider the provision in PN 790 we looked at earlier, that an incident commander may be put in a position where he has to revoke stay put and take consequential steps. Would you agree with that? It wasn't covered.
It doesn't appear so, no.
Can we go to page 2, which is headed Y? And the first bullet point we see there is Lakanal. What was the point or purpose of the exercise insofar as it related or concerned Lakanal?
Well, because Policy Note 790 was as a result of a direct self-appointed action as a result of Lakanal House, I think it was quite rightly thought useful to explain to the attendees that Lakanal House has prompted us to think about this triangulation of information.
Could we go to page 6, please? We see there that, fourth bullet point, that the scenario was to include 3 FSG call concerning 4 persons. Can you help us? Was there a particular thought process as to why 3 FSGs was considered the optimal scenario for these purposes?
I think it was to reflect Lakanal, because whilst there were 5 FSG calls at Lacanau, there was only ever 3 simultaneous calls. So I think this was to reflect the fact that of those 3 simultaneous calls at Lacanau.
Bearing in mind the emotion and the force of C.C. Simmons's statement that we refer to and was quoted expressly in the Lacanau control room, do you know whether any active consideration was given to including a significantly greater number of FSG calls, by which I mean more than 5, so as to properly and effectively stress test the adequacy of the arrangements set out under PN 790?
No, I don't think it was, but I am aware that with this exercise, I believe there was a background exercise going on in control that simulated the pressures that Harry Simmons was referring to. So the background exercise in control wasn't just about 3 survival guidance calls going on simultaneously. They were simulating other incidents going on, nothing whatsoever to do with this, to put pressure on the control room. So that pressure would have been felt regardless of whether it was for this one incident or others, a combination of.
Can we leave these briefing notes and go to an email correspondence that you had with Group Manager Lindridge? We can find that at LFB 00118958. Now we see that on the 9th of January 2013, Group Manager Lindridge emailed you a summary of the discussion that had taken place that day about exercise flooring. Now, Group Manager Lindridge set out certain observations in respect of PN 539, PN 790 and the RIFs. And if we can look at PN 790, which is the second subject heading in the email, and the third bullet point, where he says this: provide detail around the use of secondary comms networks and the need to avoid multiple simultaneous lines of communications. Now, did that point refer to information exchange about FSG calls between control and the incident ground? Can you remember?
I believe so, yes.
Can you help us? And if your memory doesn't allow an answer, please say so. But what aspect of the exercise had led to this particular conclusion? Can you remember?
I think it was that there was difficulty in communicating between control and the command units because of the number of transmissions that needed to go on. And I seem to remember that the solution for this was a dedicated hotline put in the control room that could be used by the command unit to avoid the overload of information.
Can we look further down in this email? We see the further, I think it's the final subheading, exercise documentation. And Mr. Lindridge said this: the exercise should be implemented into a regular training programme. Now, what was discussed, can you remember now, about the need for a regular training programme?
They were discussions that I had with Scott, or Richard rather. Sorry, it would have been Richard at this time, wouldn't it? Well, Richard Scott, 'cause I think Richard might have been away at that time. So I discussed with them about arranging these, and I had a responsible officer in centre operations managing command units, so they fell within my area of responsibility. And then later on, when Tom George was appointed AC, one of the deliberate decisions I made was that he would be responsible for command units as well as control to help bring these together even further.
Are you able to help us as to whether the particular recommendation regarding training was in fact implemented?
There were certainly regular exercises, and they started in 2013. And apart from the impact of vision in 15, they carried on, and then really ramped up in 2016, I seem to remember.
Can I now turn to a separate topic, which is the nature and extent of Assistant Commissioner Chandler's involvement?
Yes.
Now, if we can go to LFB 000 28942. Now, we can see that you emailed AC Chandler on the 4th of April 2013, and if we go broadly 2/3 down page 1, there's the heading Brigade Control, where you say this: please go through every point on the LACNOR action plan and the audit and pull them together in one spreadsheet and satisfy yourself that everything has been completed. Now here, the action plan, I think, refers to pre-inquest actions rather than those directly arising from the coroner's recommendations. Is that right?
Yes.
Does the word audit refer to the Lindridge review of January 2013?
Yes.
What had prompted this email to be sent by you at the start of April 2013?
So, Richard had just returned from extended period of leave, and that had obviously been a period where Scott had started reporting back to me in that intervening period, and given the issues that we discussed earlier on this morning, I wanted a second opinion. So I wanted Richard to look at this and just double check for me that everything was working in the way I was told it was working, and also it was to get Richard back into the thick of it because he'd been away for 4 or 5 months.
Thank you. Could we go to LFB 000 60701? Can we look at the second email on that page, which is Mr. Chandler's response to you, where he set out in blue the summary conclusions of his review of the LACNOR pre-inquest actions. Could we go to page 2 and look at the heading that concerned item 14? Under the heading FSG, Policy for Communication with the Fireground, he wrote this: yes, this is now in place. It was last amended in May 2013 and is due for review in February 2015. I would, however, question if this should be an operational assurance policy or a mobilising policy. Although this policy is in place and the interaction between control, ORT and operational crews is improving, there is still further progress to be made. Did you discuss that particular action with Mr. Chandler?
Yes.
Can you remember now the gist or the thrust of that discussion?
Yes, it was very much as we'd said earlier. So Richard, in his interactions with Control, had picked up on the point that Dave Lindridge had, that Control were feeling that it was operationally focused. And my response to that is, it's a non-issue who writes the policy. It applies to operations and control equally, because without either of them, the policy won't work. And so it's just for us to embed that in continuation training with control to drive that point home.
Were there any other particular points in relation to which Mr. Chandler felt that progress needed to be made?
Not in terms of things not working well, but in terms of, yes, we'd started doing the training, familiarisation training, and we needed to carry on with that and most probably start to ramp it up. And also include regularly station managers.
Now, looking at the first recommended action concerning Action 14, Mr. Chandler said this: focus to be made on the future integrated control training courses recommended in Rule 43 response to the coroner, towards improving and harmonising the language used between control and the fireground. Now, looking at that particular recommendation, do you agree that the intended focus of the proposed integrated training was on information exchange between control and the fireground and not on the handling of FSG calls?
Yes.
Given that, did you consider to what extent the handling of FSG calls should form part of the proposed integrated training?
No, but only because I didn't see from the result of what Richard was saying here that he was proposing or suggesting there were any issues that he'd found with the handling of fire survival guidance calls as a result of him looking at policy note 790.
Could we go to LFB 00110030? Now, on the 28th of August 2013, Dave Archer, who's Assistant Commissioner Cotton's personal assistant, sent you and Director Reason a copy of the Rule 43 Action Plan in advance of a meeting that was to follow the next day. Now, we can find the attachment at LFB 00110031. Now, this document was a consolidated action plan arising from the coroner's recommendations made following Shirley Towers as well as the Lacknell inquests. Did you read it?
Yes.
If we can turn to page 11, and we see at the bottom of the page item 14 is addressed, and it flowed from the Shirley Towers inquest that, quotes, consider the training and supervision required for control staff to enable relevant information to be captured and passed to operational firefighters. Is that right?
Yes.
That was then divided into 3 separate LFB actions, the first of which was to review LFB policy and procedure. Is that right?
Yes.
And that was assigned to AC Mobilising, who I think was AC Chandler at this time until he left in October 2013. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, in the 4th column, you see there is an update on the 3rd of June. I should say the 5th column, an update on the 3rd of June 2013. And if we scroll down to page 12, we see in the last substantive paragraph on that page, under that column, it says this: although Policy 790 outlines communications between control and the fireground, there are still a number of issues that appear to cause a disconnect in relation to communication between control and the fireground. This can be classified into 4 key areas. 1, competence issues of the control room staff. 2, training. See item 13. Now, pausing there, what were the competence issues concerning control staff?
I'm not quite sure exactly what he's referring to here.
If you can't remember or can't assist, I'll leave it there.
Yeah.
Can we go back in this document to page 10? Bottom of this page, we see item 13, another which flows from Shirley Towers. And it said this: review the training given to control staff in relation to recent GRAs, so generic risk assessments, including GRA 3.2. That too was assigned to AC Mobilising, who was AC Chandler. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And now we see in the far right column another update given on the 3rd of June 2013. And if we can look in the 2nd paragraph, which is in the very bottom right of the page, it says this: none of the subsections dealt with a recommendation to train control staff in information provided within GRAs. Further investigation has shown, organisationally, we would not use GRAs as a training subject. The GRAs populate LFB policy, and therefore training would be based around the policy, not GRA. Currently, the high-rise firefighting policy is not an integral part of control training. The training undertaken within control covers only the mobilising aspect of a high-rise incident and not the wider implications. Below that is a yet further update dated the 4th of July 2013. It said this: discussion is currently underway with our training provider on how the recommendations made to the coroner in the Lacknell Rule 43 recommendations will be delivered. The HFRS, if you can just help us what that stands for.
HFRS. Oh, Hampshire Fire and Rescue Service.
Thank you. Issue is integral in these training issues and will be included within these discussions. Lot of material there, but there's a short question. Are you able to help us as to what the outcome was of these deliberations?
No, I'm afraid I can't.
Was it decided that control staff would receive training on the substance of GRA 3.2 insofar as it affected their roles?
Well, on that I can help. So the summary beforehand is absolutely right in terms of the way we operated. That control wouldn't have been asked to, or any manager in control wouldn't have been asked to look through GRA 3.2 because organisationally we already had and incorporated it within Policy Note 633, high rise. So any training for control that was necessary for what they needed to do would have fallen out of Policy Note 633. In terms of going back to your original question, the training provider, I'm sorry, I can't recall exactly what fell out of those discussions.
Don't worry. Can we go on to a separate email now? LFB 000 92407. Now, you sent Director Reason an email the next day following on from Dave Archer's email, and you said, "Thanks for this morning. Does this revised version work for you?" And you attached the consolidated Rule 43 action plan with your revisions, and if we can look at the substance of those revisions, or at least some of them, they can be found at LFB 000 92408/11. Now, we can see that you'd been vigorously exercising the track change facility here, and that you deleted most of the entry against item 14A, including the 4 key areas causing a disconnect between control and the fireground under PN 790. Can you help us as to why you deleted all of that material?
So this would be the second comment box, would it?
Yes, well, I'm looking at the first comment box at the top and the second one as well, but particularly the second one.
Well, I think the second one, basically the way I operated was trying to be succinct and concise where possible.
So for stylistic rather than substantive?
Yes, I think the second one is trying to be more concise and to the point. And certainly that looks, although I haven't just read everything in that top box, but it would, to my eye, it would have been just to try to be to the point.
The downside, though, of brevity has been removing some of the substance and flavour of some of the concerns that have arisen, which would have been useful for a reader to have known when assessing the effectiveness of the completed actions. Would you accept that criticism?
I accept that there's the potential for that, of course. So I would say 2 things. Firstly, that certainly wasn't the intention. And secondly, when we discussed these documents, it wasn't a case of just what's written and then move on. There would have been discussion at the board about it. So I'm confident that whilst there might have been a briefer action update, that doesn't mean to say that we didn't discuss it in more depth when we met as a group.
Now, can we go to LFB 000400029? As you can see, these are minutes of a meeting of the Operational Directorates Coordination Board held on the 3rd of September 2013. Could we turn to page 3 and item 7 in particular? We can see on the bottom of that page, this item considered the Rule 43 monitoring report amongst other matters. And if we can turn over the page again and look at the first line, we see that specific issues were raised during the discussion of the report, including item 13, which is the third point there, and it says this: AC/mob, so I think that's AC for mobilising, is it?
Yes.
Advised that control use their judgment when dealing with high-rise compartment buildings, though it was acknowledged that this is a complex matter which requires further consideration. What complexities required further consideration? Can you remember?
Well, the complexities are that fire survival guidance, obviously, in a high-rise is different to that in a normal dwelling, and so therefore the fire survival guidance needs to be, specifically modified, and therefore the complexities are that staff handling those calls need to have an excellent grip on the surroundings and the risks and the dangers that are impacting on the caller. So it makes it far more complex in a high-rise than it does in a normal house.
Can I now turn to the Lindridge Review of November 2013? And if we go to LFB 000-83978/4. And here we see in the lower half email, on the 15th of November 2013, you emailed Scott Hayward, and you said this: I've just met with Dave Lindridge to discuss whether there are any outstanding pieces in the Lacknell Action Plan. As a result, I've asked Dave to discuss with you, that's Dave Lindridge, to discuss with you the following issues to ensure any outstanding issues are completed. Action 14 is mentioned further down the page, and you said this: creation of policy for communications from control to the fireground. It seems there might be some specific observations made as a result of Dave's review that need to be considered in future reviews of FSG policy. We need to confirm what these observations are. Has a review of FSG been completed? Whether these observations have been considered. If not, then why not? What were the specific observations you thought he might have?
I seem to recall that they are the same observations that we've discussed already in terms of transfer of information, the potential for an overflow, if you like, through poor radio discipline, too much information being passed or received and not in an orderly fashion. I think, and not having the facility to be able to do it, I think it was around that.
Now, Mr. Lindridge had, in January 2013, had reported that his observations were due to be considered as part of a forthcoming FSG review. Now, it would appear from this email that the FSG review remained in prospect rather than being a concluded fact. Is that right?
It would appear so, yes. The FSG, the 539 I think, was due for a scheduled review that year. So if November 13, then it was slightly overdue.
Sir, it's 3:20. It is a convenient point if it's convenient for you and
Yes.
the witness.
Thank you. Well, I think it's time we had a break, Mr. Brown, so we'll stop there. We'll resume, please, at 4:25. And again, please don't discuss your evidence while you're out of the room.
Thank you, sir.
All right. Thank you very much. Would you like to go to the usher, please? Thank you very much. 4:25.
Thanks, sir.
Would you ask Mr. Brown to come back in, please? All right, Mr. Brown?
Yes, thank you, sir.
On we go then. Yes, Mr. Kinnear.
Thanks, sir. Could we now turn to GRA 3.2, and in particular how that fed into the arrangements, policy arrangements at control? Could we turn to LFB 000 93616? Now we see on the 10th of May 2012, Michelle Kaniki emailed you the latest draft of GRA 3.2, and we can see in the second paragraph she said this: the attached high-rise GRA has already been through regional consultation and a number of amendments accepted, highlighted in track changes. Due to the inevitable amendments resulting from the regional consultation process, it was felt prudent to wait until the national consultation, second round, prior to issuing this revised document for internal consultation. Am I right that LFB Control had not given or hadn't contributed to the draft before this point, i.e. May 2012?
That's correct.
In the third paragraph, she wrote this: please review this document with a view to identifying impact on LFB procedures, especially those areas where changes to the main text have been highlighted using track changes, as well as any other comments, observations and amendments felt necessary. Did you review, in a sense of scrutinise, this document?
Not personally. I sent this to staff as I would in normal circumstances for their comments.
Were you aware of the particular provisions concerning FSG calls?
No. Not prior to sending it out to staff, no.
Now, we have been unable to find any emails in which you forwarded this email to anyone in control. Did you ask anyone at control to review the substance of GRA 3.2 in this particular draft?
I couldn't honestly put my hand on my heart and say I did. All I would say is my normal practice was to send it out to the POM and the 4 area DACs and the DAC in central operations. That would be my normal practice, and I don't see why I would have done any different in this circumstance, but I couldn't give you a guarantee that I did.
We can't find anything, so I want to give you an opportunity to confirm whether or not, but there we go. Now, if we can look at GRA 3.2 and go to LFB 000 1255. This is the version that was finally published in February 2014. I assume you've read the generic risk assessment in its final form, is that right?
Yes.
And could we go to page 20? And if we look at the second paragraph on that page, it says this: fire and rescue authorities must also have effective arrangements in place to handle fire survival guidance calls from residents and others when they believe they are unable to leave the building due to disability, poor mobility, illness, or the effects of fire. Now, after GRA 3.2 was published in February 2014, did you take any steps, effective steps, to ensure that control had effective arrangements for such residents?
No, but I was satisfied that they already had these arrangements, notwithstanding the discussions we've had earlier on today in terms of policy, but I was satisfied that the questioning that control officers do would naturally bring out these issues.
Did you specifically ask yourself that question, having read this paragraph, as to whether the arrangements that were in place were effective to assist those who had disability, poor mobility, illness?
I didn't read it, stop and think, consider and then move on, but it was a natural process in my mind that yes, we do already deal with this.
Looking at the fourth paragraph on this page, it sets out what FSG called arrangements should include. And we see the third bullet point, for example, it anticipates a re-evaluation process. Did you flag that particular provision once GRA 3.2 had been published with control?
No. However, again, my view is that the reassess ticks this re-evaluation box.
Can we go on to page 30 within the document? As you see at the bottom of the page, the specific provisions governing FSG starts here and extends over the page. Now, after GRA 3.2 was published, did you consider asking anyone in control to review the document to ensure that PN 790, PN 539 and the RIFs were consistent with the detailed provisions of the GRA?
I never asked that specific question, but going back to my answer a few minutes ago in terms of the consultation, I do think I know my normal practice was to send it out to officers. So I do believe I would have sent it to control, so I would have taken that as read. But again, as I said, I can't for sure say. But I didn't specifically ask that question, no.
Could we now move on to a separate topic, which is training and LACNAL issues and the associated pre-inquest actions? Now, the first of the topics I'd like to discuss with you is the identification and provision of training. And to start that off, could we go to a paragraph in Mr. Hayward's first statement, which we can find at LFB 000555191/17. And if we could look at paragraph 48 in particular, Mr. Hayward said this: Control senior management reviews the training need for staff on an ongoing basis to identify new themes and ensure that OST creates training packages for these GESIP, which we know MTFA, is that marauding terrorist firearms?
Yes.
And deliver these to all staff. Was that how you understood that the training needs of control staff would be identified and met?
It's one of them, yes.
Did you yourself have any involvement in this process?
Not in the process of identifying training needs specifically, no. Unless a training need I become conscious of a particular need because of a particular event or a particular meeting.
Did you yourself monitor whether the training needs of control had been effectively identified and effectively met, or did you delegate that function to Mr. Hayward and his managers?
I would have delegated that function to Mr. Hayward, but then I would have also kept a watching brief on the brigade-wide performance to see if there was any implications for control.
Could we stay in this statement but turn to page 18 and look at paragraph 52? And Mr. Hayward says this: due to the need to ensure that control is able to continue to carrying out its day-to-day functions, most training by necessity is delivered to staff who are on watch. This means that, if there is a significant incident or a sudden increase in calls, the staff, including the OST, might be recalled to their positions in the control room to answer and handle 999 emergency calls. 53. As was intended when the new shift system was implemented in 2011, trainer-led training took place within the short shift. In the period between April 2011 and April 2014, there was a 4-hour overlap between the two shifts. The effect of this was that I could release staff from training whilst maintaining service delivery, although this did depend on sickness and other leave. From April 2014 to date, the early short shift start time was moved to 0800 hours in order to support the SBM function, which meant that the overlap shift reduced to 2 hours, i.e. 1400 to 1600 hours. Now, just to ensure that I've understood this correctly, Mr. Brown, after April 2011, control training took place within the 4-hour shift overlap while staff were on watch. Is that a fair understanding?
Yes, it is. If I can just caveat that, I was heavily involved in the shift change. It was one of the strategic issues, and it was my expectation that whilst that 4-hour period would be used for certain types of training, it shouldn't be the only place that training takes place. And I think that the view has become the case that it's only that 4-hour period where training can take place. My view was that once the short shift started at 10 o'clock, then there could be some all-day training that could start to take place.
Were you aware that the early shift moved in April 2014?
No, I wasn't, and I wasn't particularly impressed when I found out it had moved.
Can you remember when you found out that it had been moved?
I can't remember exactly when, but it came up, and in a meeting with Scott, that it had already happened, and I remember my reaction was, well, A, why wasn't I consulted on it, and B, I'm really not happy about it because it's unpicking what we haven't long implemented. And I spent a lot of time and effort in getting this new shift in.
With the consequential reduction in training time?
Well, a reduction in that 4-hour period, yes. Yeah. It was done for good reason. I understand why, but nevertheless, it wasn't something that I was consulted on.
Could we turn to INQ 000 14945? Now, I'm assuming you're familiar with the Fire Service Manual, even if it isn't a document that you consulted on a daily basis. Is that a fair assumption?
Yes.
And it was published in 1998, is that right?
I believe so, yes.
Now, if we can go to page 129 in this document, hopefully we should find Appendix 1, Control Staff Training Competence Promotion. There we go. And we can see in the right-hand column, it says this in the first substantive paragraph. Training for control personnel has always been hindered by the small number of staff available and the need to maintain cover in the control centre. Training is usually watch-related and carried out at the normal place of work. This ensures the maximum number of personnel available. For these reasons, Brigade should consider the provision of a training officer and/or watch training days away from control. First of all, were you previously aware of that particular requirement?
Yes.
Did you ever suggest to Mr. Hayward that he consider facilitating training days away from control to ensure that training was not interrupted by service demands?
These were issues that we discussed at length, and there's good reason for there's challenges for watch training days away from control. One of them is terms and conditions of control officers, which I don't believe support us in being able to compel people to come in on their off-duty days. So for a variety of reasons, including the ability to be able to staff the control room should there be an incident, we always fell back on the provision of providing on-watch training, albeit in a separate room. So when we moved to Merton, there were separate training rooms. So all intents and purposes, it appeared completely away from the control room unless the alarm sounded.
Thank you. Can we now turn to the next topic, which is the planning of training? Now, presumably you would accept that as a basic requirement, control should have a structured training plan.
Yes.
Now, can we, bearing in that mind, Scott Hayward said in evidence that there was never a formal written plan for delivering training to control staff. Were you aware of that omission?
There was never an all-encompassing plan. There was a delivery plan for the operational support team, but there was never an all-encompassing plan for staff on watches. There was, however, individual plans for specific pieces of training. But nevertheless, it was something that I wanted, and I spoke with Richard Chandler about achieving it in 2013, I think.
We'll come on to that. One of the points that arose out of Mr. Hayward's evidence was that, to his knowledge, you had never asked him to produce the overarching training plan. Does that accord with your recollection?
Well, I certainly asked Richard to deal with it. Whether I subsequently asked Scott after Richard left, I wouldn't have let it drop. So no, I think it's unlikely that Scott and I never had a discussion on an overarching training plan.
Could we now look at the audit of control training that was carried out by Station Manager Kelly and he reported in August 2010? That can be found at LFB 00109092. Now, if we can go to page 7 in that document, in particular, paragraphs 47 to 49. Those paragraphs say this. 47. It appears that adequate long-term planning of the regularly delivered elements of the BCTD curriculum is not being carried out. This may account for the fact that the delivery of fire survival continuation training to observed candidates fell outside the parameters of recommendations found in the emergency call handling techniques and fire survival guidance training document, i.e. 12 monthly. 48. However, Brigade Control Principal Management have stated that once the current tranche of fire survival training is completed, it is planned for all staff to receive a full course every 24 months, with 12 monthly interim training being delivered via a computer-based training solution. Notwithstanding the above, it is vitally important that adequate training planning systems are implemented for all courses, including appropriate training records that support the cyclical training planning process. And if we look at paragraph 50, it sets out recommendations. And the one at the bottom of the page is implement adequate training planning and recording systems. Now, we can see against the first line of paragraph 47 that you commented in the following terms: is this still the case post-LACNAL? Now, that question implies that it shouldn't have been the case. Is that an accurate reading of your comment?
Yes.
Against the recommendation to implement adequate training planning, you commented, doesn't para 48 do this? Can we take it from your comment that in your view, the proposal for a biennial FSG training programme without more constituted an adequate training planning system?
But bearing in mind this whole document was about fire survival guidance, so in itself it was focused on a particular element, then my comments have related just to that. So yes, I am suggesting that the biennial training of fire survival guidance, i.e. full day, half day, would meet that. However, this recommendation 50, in terms of an all-encompassing training plan, then no, paragraph 48 wouldn't have met that.
Yeah. Did you discuss this recommendation, looking at paragraph 50, with Scott Hayward?
Yes.
And can you remember what steps, effective or otherwise, did Mr. Hayward take to implement that recommendation?
Well, the recommendation in relation to fire survival guidance training, at this time, there was a robust plan. The first tranche of fire survival guidance training, I think, ran from the summer through to September time, I think, and then carried on in a half day the following year, etc. It was thereafter that it started to unravel to a degree.
You say unravel. What do you mean by that, and what were the consequences?
Well, so what I mean by that, it was intended to do a full day in 2010, then a half day in 11, etc. Then in 2012 should have been a full day, and I found out sometime after that hadn't been the case, and at that point there was discussions about role play and 4 hours versus all day, etc. And was making some discoveries in terms of what had gone on wasn't what I had expected. So that's what I mean by unravelling.
Thank you. We'll come on to your intervention in due course.
Okay, thank you.
Before we do so, can we go to your second witness statement, which can be found at LFB 000-84020/20. And if we look at paragraph 55, you say this. At paragraph 30 of my statement, dated 29th of January 2019, I refer to Brigade Policy Note 164, Training, PN 164. And pausing there, PN 164, the proper title, I think, is Training Control Staff New Entrant. Is that right?
Yes.
This iteration of PN 164 was current as at January 2009. There are sections within PN 164 that address the systems in place for continuation training, Section 2, and refresher training, Section 3. I've also reviewed PN 164 that was current at the time I left the Brigade in March 2017. I've nothing further to add to the information provided in PN 164 in response to this request. Now, if we look at the two versions of 164 that you've exhibited to your statement, the first was issued in September 94 and amended in January 2009, and the second was reviewed as current in May 2015. Now, we don't need to go to the document yet, but is it right that as Head of Service Delivery and Mobilising, you were the owner of PN 164?
Yes.
And certainly when Station Manager Kelly carried out his audit in August 2010?
Yes.
Now, there is no requirement, and you can take it from me, in either version of PN 164 for a training plan to be produced. Were you aware of the absence of such a provision?
Yes, I guess I was, yes.
Yeah. And presumably you were prepared to tolerate that omission. If so, why?
Because just because it doesn't say something in policy, that, as far as I'm concerned, that doesn't mean I can't request it for good managerial reasons. And if someone would have said to me, well, I'm not going to do that because that's not in policy, then I think we'd have had a very, very robust discussion about it. So in not everything is going to be written in policy. It's just good managerial practice. So I didn't really see it as a particular issue whether it was in or not.
But it's just to come back on that, the existence of a training plan is the basic building block of effective training. Would you agree with that?
Yes, yes.
And given that the provision would be a sentence, or maybe slightly more than one sentence, it was hardly an onerous inclusion or incorporation within PN 164, was it?
No, absolutely. And there's no good reason why it shouldn't be in there. I guess the point I'm just trying to make is I don't see his absence as getting in the way of producing one, but I'll take your point. It would have been helpful to have had it in there.
And maybe reinforce the message to
Yes.
control as well.
Yes.
Can we look at the audit trail on the most recent version of the policy, by which I mean May 2015, which can be found at LFB 000-84054/11. And we see from the history of the document's evolution that the policy was last updated, I think, on the 11th of November 2010. Is that correct?
So when you say it was last...
Sorry, you can say that it was updated.
Oh, yes, yes.
I misled you, sorry, on the 11th of
Yes.
November.
Yeah.
Now, given that date, did you give any consideration to ensuring that when PN 64 was reviewed and updated in November 2010, it took into account the substance of Mr. Kelly's recommendations made in his report of August 2010?
No, I don't think I did.
Can you help us as to why not? If you can't remember.
Well, no. The only reason I'm pausing is because if it had been a naturally occurring scheduled 3-yearly review, then I would just remind the relevant people that it needs to be reviewed. And I was just trying to work out in my mind whether 2010 was a natural one, because if it is a natural one, that's probably more likely why I omitted to put it in. But it didn't occur to me at the time, natural review or not, to say we need to amend policy to include that. Because, as I say, my view was that a training plan should be produced in any case. So I think it's something that I've obviously overlooked.
Thank you. Can we turn to LFB 00106146? We see here that Mr. Hayward emailed you a document entitled Lack of Control Action Sheet. First of all, had you asked him to prepare an action sheet?
Yes, this would have been following one of our meetings.
What had prompted that? Had it been the Lindridge review?
Yes, so this was very much what was going on at the time, and I wanted to see exactly what Scott was doing about it, particularly because Richard wasn't available at this moment.
Could we go to that action sheet, which is at LFB 00106147? And if we look at the bottom of page 1, it says in the second column, reading from the left, 2-year training matrix, including all control training, FSG refresher. Then reading across in the third column, it says matrix being created by the OST. And then finally, in the far right column under the heading outcomes, it says this: senior managers with OST have revised systems for the release of staff for training delivery. To be implemented shortly, the 2-yearly matrix will form the backbone to this plan. Completion date, end of January 2013, but the plan will evolve as a living document projecting training for the future on a rolling basis. Now, were you surprised, concerned, or annoyed to see that more than 2 years after the recommendation had been made by Mr. Kelly, a plan was still not in place for control training?
Yes.
All three, or one in particular of those emotions?
Not surprised, because we'd been having these discussions, and I think Scott here is referring specifically to fire survival guidance. So whenever I used to chase for a plan, I would seem to be sent various component parts of plans rather than one all-encompassing plan. And so this was his plan just for fire survival guidance calls. And whilst this plan, notwithstanding what I said a short while ago, was working, it still wasn't dealing with my overall approach to training that I was after.
Following on from that, and your reference to Mr. Chandler, can we go to LFB 00028942? We've been to this a number of occasions now. You emailed Mr. Chandler on the 4th of April 2013. If we turn to the top of page 2, you can see the first substantive bullet point there where you say, on a wider training issue, can you talk me through the training plan for control? Why did you make that particular request of Mr. Chandler at this time, i.e. April 2013?
Again, because this was part of a range of things that I had in mind for when Richard returned, things that were building up, and this was one of them, because I still wasn't getting to where I wanted to be in terms of the training plan, and I knew I'd spoken to Richard about it previously before he left, he had extended leave period, and so I wanted to remind him that it was something that was overdue.
What was his response?
I can't remember his email response, but we met regularly, and he told me, I think, it's in hand.
Did you receive the oft-promised matrix or not?
No.
Did you ask for that matrix?
I did, and I think Richard's response was, "I'm onto it, but I'm just back after a period of time. Leave it with me." And so I left it with him, and to see what he come back with.
That is April 2013. Can we go to LFB 000-32826? This is Tom George's report entitled Review of Brigade Control. You can see dated July 2016, so slightly more than 3 years after the email exchange with Mr. Chandler. Now, we'll come back to this review in more detail probably on Monday, but for the time being, can we go to page 22 and paragraph 47? Sorry, it came and went. If we can go, there we go. If we look at paragraph 47. Some staff feel that they are not adequately developed in role or receive development to progress to a higher role. The review has identified that maintenance of skills training is ad hoc, not planned in a robust manner, and often not recorded on individuals' training records, ITRs. And then if we can go over to page 12, which is the recommendation at paragraph 49C at the top of the page, it says this: each OM, operations manager, is to ensure that an appropriate, robust annual watch training plan is in place for their watch, agreed by their SOM and available to all watch members and managers. All training must be recorded on an individual's ITR. The POM, SOMs, should work with colleagues from the Brigade's information management team to introduce an IT solution to this, similar to training diaries used by station staff. What was your response to the finding that training was ad hoc and still not planned in a robust manner?
Frustration.
Did you discuss both your frustration and the substance of the finding with Mr. Hayward?
No, because at this point Tom was in place, and as I said earlier, one of the reasons I wanted Tom George in there is because I wanted another AC on site to look more closely in a way that I just wasn't finding the time to do. So I was disappointingly unsurprised, but yet frustrated as well, nevertheless. I was very tempted to talk directly to Scott, but that would mean I usurped the management chain, and I've always been very keen on following the line management chain. I think it's bad management not to. So I made it clear to Tom what he needed to do. Although, to be fair to him, he knew what he needed to do.
Because he's identified it himself.
Yes, yeah.
Taking the step back, it's 6 years by this stage after Mr. Kelly's audit from August 2010, or near as damn it, 6 years. In 2016, what was your view of the reason why training was still not planned in a robust way and persisted being provided on an ad hoc basis? What was the root cause?
The root cause was firstly the fact that we didn't have IT support in the same. Well, I say Control didn't have IT support in the way that station-based staff did. That was partly to do with the shift system in terms of the way it was recognised, but that wasn't an excuse. It was also partly because Control were just used to using spreadsheets, but what they also did do was they, as I mentioned earlier, they did keep coming up with individual training plans for specific pieces of training. So they had the Fire Survival Guidance Training Plan, they had the National Control Centre Training Plan, they had the RMC Training Plan. So they had individual ones, but I think they kept falling into the trap of thinking, well, we've got all the component parts, So therefore, there it is. But my view, no, that's not what it is. And it was kind of a constant battle to try to get them to understand what it was that we really needed. And then, of course, there was vision training, which was absolutely immense. And then everything else got put to one side whilst we dealt with it.
We have not found that the matrix was ever provided to you. Does that accord with your understanding?
Yes.
Could we go to your first witness statement, LFB 000 321 66/15? Now, if we look at paragraph 40, where you say this: I retired from the LFB before any of the recommendations set out in AC George's review report were implemented. The responsibility for those recommendations passed from me to the then AC Tom George, now Director of Operations. Can you help us as to why you yourself didn't take urgent action on receipt of the George recommendation in July 2016 to ensure robust training plans were put in place?
I think because I had taken one step back or up, whichever way you wish to describe it, in terms of becoming a Director of Operations, and the link between me and control was now elongated because Tom was managing control, and for me to lean in and take instant action, particularly around there still was the issues going on with training with vision. It's just not the way I did business. So Tom had been brought in and given the specific role of Brigade control with a few other add-ons, but nevertheless had the luxurious position of being able to concentrate and be based there in a way that I never could. So I really just underlined the issue with Tom, although he knew it himself anyway, that this needed to be done, rather than me just stepping in over him and doing it, which I think just would have been bad management.
Mr. Brown, thank you. Sir, I've reached a point where I should be moving on to a fresh topic, which is the complex one of training and record keeping.
Yes.
I will not get that topic completed in quarter of an hour, and if I start now, I shall leave Mr. Brown hanging in mid-question, which I think is unfair on Mr. Brown. We are very well placed. The entirety of Monday has been allocated to Mr. Brown's evidence.
Oh, really? The whole of Monday?
Whole of Monday. I'm absolutely confident that his evidence will be done and dusted within that day. And so at this point, I don't think there's any prejudice for us pulling up stumps now. It's been a long day anyway, and we can complete Mr. Brown's evidence properly on Monday.
Right. Well, thank you. Well, you've heard what Mr. Kinnear has said. I think the option is to plough on for another 10 or 15 minutes and reach a bad point at which to stop, or to break a bit early, which may not be entirely uncongenial, I don't know. But it does mean that I'm afraid we'll have to ask you to come back to continue your evidence on Monday morning. But I think that was programmed, wasn't it?
It was, sir, yes.
Right. So on the basis that, as you heard Mr. Kinnear say, you'll finish on Monday sometime, don't quite know when, I think it would be sensible to stop now.
Okay, thank you.
So we'll break there. We'll resume, please, at 10 o'clock on Monday morning. And as I said to you before, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence or anything relating to it over the weekend.
Okay, thank you, sir.
All right. Thank you very much. Would you give the usher then, please? All right, Mr. Kinnear. Well, we shall finish this witness on Monday then.
We shall.
One way or another.
We will.
Very good. Thank you very much. We'll stop there and resume at 10 o'clock on Monday morning.
Thanks, sir.
Thank you very much.